Hello? Hello?
Hi.
Hi. This is the room for the symposium, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Was there any information sent out for the room monitors?
I don't think so. Not that I saw.
Okay.
Are you our room monitor, Denise?
Yes, I'm supposed to be, but no.
We're in the right place. And let's see if Marianne has gotten in yet. Marianne, have you gotten in yet?
I think Marianne is on her way.
Okay, she says she's coming. So we're gonna run a little long. I'm just letting you know now, Jan. The room is open.
Hey, Vernice. So Secure, my esteemed colleague, is going to be helping out with this session. While she's going to be the monitor in the room, I am in another room.
Okay.
But I hope you guys have a great session.
Thank you. We just connected. Thank you so much.
Cool.
Secure, we're just waiting for our moderator. We were in a bit of Zoom craziness, so she'll be here any second. She says she's still waiting.
Huh. Don't see her name.
Marianne Engelman-Lado.
Yes. Let me send her the link again and make sure that she has it.
Okay.
Oh, I see her. I'm admitting her right now.
Okay.
Thank God I'm in. Hey, Vernice, and welcome to everybody. It's 1:14. Let's wait one more minute in case anyone had some of the problems we're having. And many thanks to Jan Michael Archer for getting us in the door.
And Sakira, she is she's our moderator, our tech.
Wonderful. Okay.
She found you.
Thank you. That's terrific. So 30 more seconds and we'll get going. We have 14 people and I don't know how many we expect, but thank you all for your patience. It's wonderful to see some familiar names and some new names on our participant list. Well, let's get started. It's 1:15 and we have so much we want to say. Is Father Phil Schmitter in?
Yes. Yes. I just heard him faintly say yes.
Okay, I didn't see that and I want to just make sure. I don't see him on the participants list either. Father Phil, are you there? Secura, can I trouble you to see if you can find whether Father Phil has the same barriers in there that we have, and let me know if you need to break in to figure that out.
Definitely.
Hold on just a moment. I'm sorry.
Marianne will be right back with us.
Okay, I'm back with you. I'm going to be, I'm Marianne Engelman-Lado. I'm with the Environmental Justice Clinic at Vermont Law School and also a lecturer at Yale. And I'll say a few words about myself in a few minutes, but I'm going to just say a couple words about the overall goal of the panel. And then I'll be introducing our speakers and we'll get into it. The goal of legal tools to address environmental justice are clearly to address emissions reduction. That is, we know already that communities of color are overburdened by environmental pollution, and don't have the same access to environmental benefits. And we also know that public participation, that is the opportunity to participate in decisions affecting the future of the community, run with other forms of discrimination. That is, people of color have been locked out of making decisions that affect their future. So when we think about legal tools to advance environmental justice, we're thinking about legal tools to achieve those goals, to achieve justice, both to get emissions reductions in communities of color and low-income communities, and to have access to environmental benefits, and to ensure public participation. The tools we're going to talk about today, no single tool will achieve that outcome. They're all tools to advance community participation and to provide leverage to make those kinds of changes. There is no single tool that will have that outcome, and all tools have shortcomings. In the case of civil rights law, which is going to be a main focus here, civil rights laws have not sufficiently been enforced. We're going to discuss some of the challenges faced, but also argue that using the law offers exciting leverage for change. A couple of logistics. First of all, we encourage you to put questions in the chat, and we thank Sakira Salim Carter for monitoring the chat, and I'll try to monitor it as well, and we'll try to scoop up some of your questions, and there will be time for Q&A toward the end. I also apologize that I'm going to give warnings to our speakers. If we have certain time to try to keep things moving along, and I can't discreetly pass people a note. So I will break in after the allotted time and ask you to finish up in a minute. And I'm going to do the same for myself. I'm going to put a warning on my alarm and have to stop within 1 minute. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on introductions. You can read about these wonderful people online, but I'm going to say a few words about each in the order in which people will speak, just to make sure that you have a sense of how exciting this panel is. If I can ask you to pause for, I'm just going to pause for just a moment. Okay, so we're going to start with Vernice Miller-Travis, who serves as the Executive Vice President of the Metropolitan Group. As an author of the seminal 1987 study, Toxic Waste and Race. And let me just pause on that and say how incredible it is that Vernice has been part of the growth and development of the environmental justice movement and brings that perspective to this panel. As the author of that seminal study and co-founder of We Act for Environmental Justice, she is one of the nation's leading experts and pioneer on environmental justice. She served on the EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council and was recently awarded the Robert Bullard Environmental Justice Award from the Sierra Club. We don't have time to give Vernice, or honestly any of our speakers, justice, but I encourage you to find out more about them. Next, we'll hear from Father Phil Schmitter, who has been a resident of Flint, Michigan since 1970, and is the co-founder of the St. Francis Prayer Center, which was one of the original complainants in one of the first civil rights cases filed with EPA in the United States. This initial complaint challenged the state's decision to permit the Genesee Power Station in an already environmentally overburdened neighborhood in Flint in 1992. Father Phil was also a complainant in claims against Michigan regarding Select Steel, a case that led to an infamous decision conflating civil rights and environmental law. And he is the plaintiff in a successful suit against EPA for failing to investigate civil rights complaints in a timely way. And I should say, just this week, we got a favorable ruling from a court in the Northern District of California in that case. He's been pastor of Christ the King Catholic Church since 2009. We may also be joined by Reverend Ronald Smith, whose mother Ann helped to form the Asher's Bar Smith Community Organization in Tallahassee, Alabama. And if he doesn't join us, I'll say a few extra words about that, about Tallahassee. Ron took up the mantle from his mother and is an activist in his own right and president of APSCO now. But he wears many hats, including as an instructor of forestry at Tuskegee University. And with that starting point, I'm going to turn it over to Vernice Miller-Travis.
Thank you, Marianne. Hello, everyone. Hope you've been enjoying the conference so far. This is, we've had to obviously go to the Zoom platform. Normally, we would all be gathered together, hundreds of us at the University of Maryland in the Student Union for the 6th annual University of Maryland Center for Environmental Health and Justice Labs Environmental Justice and Health Equities Conference. But here we are on Zoom, and we seem to be doing pretty great because people are joining from all over the country, not just from the DMV. And so I'm really happy to be with you and really happy that you all are here. So let me jump right into the subject matter. So early on in the initial conceptualization of environmental justice, and in some of the earliest conversations back in the 80s, in the late 80s, when people from all over the country were working on a variety of environmental threats and environmental challenges in their own communities. And one thing that we recognized early on in each place, and as Marianne said, I'm the co-founder of We Act for Environmental Justice, and while I was working on toxic waste and race in the United States for the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, which at the time was headquartered in Midtown Manhattan, I was also working with my neighbors in my hometown in West Harlem in New York City. And the very issues that we were looking at in the research in terms of predominance of polluting facilities and environmentally harmful facilities in communities of color was happening right where I lived. And I literally stumbled across those issues and joined forces with some neighbors. Eventually that led to the launching of We Act, West Harlem Environmental Action in 1988. And right away, the issues and the prominence of race and the potential that this was about racial discrimination came immediately to the fore. And one of the biggest findings out of toxic waste and race in the United States is that we tested for a variety of different social variables. I think we tested for about 120 different social variables, including level of educational attainment, per capita income, home ownership, home rentership, on and on and on and on. Race was one of the things that we tested for. And by testing, I mean, we were trying to look at the relationship between three things. This was our original hypothesis. Where are hazardous waste sites located in the United States of America? And those sites we took from the US EPA's national priorities list of the most hazardous sites that pose imminent threat to human health and the environment. We used that list, the NPL list. We then took the sites on that list and determined what address they were located in, and then what zip code those addresses and those sites were located in, and then what is the racial composition of the zip codes where those sites are located. And then we ran all those variables to see, well, what's the closest association? Is it because people were low income, though they weren't always? Is it because people didn't have graduate degrees, though that was not always the case? What was the association between where those sites were and the people who lived near it? And what our research and data showed us in 1987 was that race proved to be the most statistically significant indicator in where these sites were located. Now, you would probably say, like my grandmother did, duh, you really spent money looking at that? My grandmother was a nurse, and when I told her what we were doing, she was just astounded that this church would spend money on this. And I remember her distinctly saying she was so glad she didn't belong to the United Church of Christ. And I remember saying, Grandma, how could you say such a thing? And she said, because every Black person in America knows that wherever we are, that's where the landfill is, that's where the incinerator is, that's where all the hazardous stuff is, that's where the water is not clean, that's where the housing is dilapidated, the infrastructure, meaning sidewalks, roads, etc., will not be the same as in white communities. Where we live is where all the bad things are that no one else wants to live next to. And she was absolutely right about that. And that's what we were trying to underscore in this report. But as you well know, and I remember saying this to my grandmother, that our lived experience is never taken as valid, right? You have to have some peer-reviewed study by some university, by some public health school, by some local government, by some health department. You have to have some study that says the thing that we've been living with for decades is in fact real. But if we say it, it doesn't have the same validity. And so that was one of the reasons that we wanted to write that report and publish that report, is to codify and capture the reality of so many people of color, so many tribal communities, so many low-income communities, so many immigrant communities from across the United States of America. So we did that. But when we saw that race was the most statistically significant indicator, we also immediately could leap to another set of understandings, that this is yet another dimension of the fight for racial justice and equal treatment before the law. This is yet another space and another arena in which we have to struggle to be treated just like everybody else. And again, we're not asking for special treatment in the environmental justice arena. We're just asking for equal treatment. If there's a Clean Air Act, then by golly, let's fully and vigorously enforce that in the places where we live. If there's a Clean Water Act, and there is, let's make sure that's fully enforced in the places where we live. If there are regulations around how hazardous waste is supposed to be transported, stored, contained, landfilled, let's make sure that those regulations are vigorously enforced in where we live. And so where we first stood as a platform was on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is the nation's premier anti-discrimination body of law and regulations. If you haven't read it in a long time, if you haven't looked at it in a long time, I would highly recommend that you review and read again the Civil Rights Act of 1964, because it is an extraordinary piece of federal legislation. It's well written, and it was written so that it would have application decades hence, not just in the 1960s, but on and on and on and on and on. It would have applicability. And if you pay attention to these kinds of issues, earlier this summer, I think it was in July, the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court rendered a decision, a historic decision, 6-3 verdict by the courts that said you cannot discriminate against gay people in the workplace and LGBTQ people in the workplace, which you could do in many states in the United States, and there would be no repercussions. You could fire somebody because they were gay. And the Supreme Court rendered a decision that said that is unconstitutional, and what? A violation of what? The Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that's what they rooted their decision in. Now, in 1964, people were not thinking about how to codify the rights of LGBTQ and I people at that moment. But they wrote that law so that it would have applicability well into the future. Well, there's a provision in that law called Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And Title VI says the following, as soon as I can find it. So I know, hopefully you all are well aware of what it says. Pursuant to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any programs or activities receiving federal financial assistance. Agencies providing financial assistance are authorized and directed to effectuate the provisions of 42 U.S.C. Section 2000 D of this title with respect to such programs or activities by issuing rules, regulations, or orders of general applicability to ensure that the goals and objectives of Title VI are enforced. And I'm here to tell you that US EPA in 2020 is still trying to figure out how to execute and implement Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. I'm being generous when I say that they're still trying to figure it out, because many years they don't try at all. And for the first 20 years of the agency, there was no serious intentionality around making sure that as EPA gave federal financial assistance to states, tribes, local governments to enforce environmental regulations, that they would ensure that those dollars were being spent in a way that did not discriminate against people who were defined as protected groups under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We entered this conversation with US EPA saying that there were two things we wanted them to make sure they did: vigorously enforce Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and make sure that people were being treated equally before every environmental law and regulation. And the two things were mixed. And where we have seen a real problem at EPA is from the beginning, even though we walked in the door saying civil rights enforcement and environmental enforcement are integrated bodies of law when it comes to the field of environmental justice, EPA immediately separated those two issues. They separated enforcement of the Civil Rights Act into its own civil rights office, which many federal agencies have done. That's not unique to EPA. But then they separated environmental justice off to another corner. And rarely do the two things meet. So though we've been talking about racial discrimination as the bedrock of environmental injustice, EPA sees those two things as completely separate. And so I'm gonna pass this conversation on, but just want to let folks know that we have been in active conversation with US EPA for 30 years. I counted it. 30 years with the Office of the Administrator, with the Office of the General Counsel, with the Office of Civil Rights, with the Office of External Civil Rights at EPA. We have been in vigorous conversation, and vigorous is not as strong a word to really capture the way that we've been trying to push and coddle and force and litigate against US EPA to make sure that it lives up to its mandated under the Civil Rights Act guarantees to ensure that people who are recipients of federal funding do not use those dollars in a way that discriminate against people who are protected under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. EPA has been woefully negligent in living up to that obligation, and we're going to hear some case studies about how woefully negligent they've been. I also would just take this opportunity to say, if you think this is a Democratic versus a Republican issue, you would be wrong. Because Marianne and I and several other people have formed a Title VI Alliance. We were pushing the Obama administration until the literal last day that they were in office to get them to push some tools out the door to tell states, this is what you're required to do. So stay tuned. Some states are taking up this mantle on their own and making sure that they push it forward. In the next couple of weeks, you're going to hear from the state of Virginia, Department of Environmental Quality, about ways that they are going to be moving forward in civil rights enforcement. But it would really be helpful if the federal government itself would set the tone, and we're still waiting for US EPA to set the tone. Marianne?
Thanks so much, Vernice. You got us off to a great start. I would mention that I've put in the chat some materials that might be helpful and some links, including a call to action that Vernice and I and others, some of whom are on the phone, I are on the line. I see Adrian Hollis and others pulled together to really raise up the need for immediate action, particularly in light of COVID and the relationship between COVID, death and illness from COVID, and race, and the relationship between air pollution and the incidence and dispersion of COVID. And folks who, community-based activists, some of whom I know have been in this symposium over the last 2 weeks, like Vincent Martin from Detroit, and civil rights activists and environmental justice leaders, all felt it was really important to make a statement about the relationship between civil rights and environmental justice and what's happening now and the urgent need for change. And I can think nobody who epitomizes the long-term struggle at the community level as well as Father Phil Schmitter. Father Phil, I already introduced you, and we've asked Father Phil to really talk about his experience, which really also epitomizes both the opportunities and the challenges of trying to utilize the Civil Rights Act, this fundamental, dramatically earth-changing law that people died for and fought for, and was finally put in place in 1964. And then in the 1990s, Father Phil and the St. Francis Prayer Center were some of the first to try to get EPA to enforce the law. And you'll hear a bit about his experience. And again, you can check the chat. I'm going to keep putting some resources in the chat, which that we've talked about before and hope will be helpful. Father Phil. I think you're on mute, Father Phil.
There, it's good to meet everybody, and I'm sorry that I'm late, but I kept waiting and I was having trouble getting in. So
You're right on time, Father Phil.
I was, as a Catholic priest, I moved into public housing on the north end of Flint, right on the border between Flint and Genesee Township. Just a second, I got to turn my phone down.
I was just going to ask other people to mute, but then it turned out to be you.
Yeah, anyway, well, I have a backed up sewer that I have an environmental problem that I have to deal with. So anyway, but I moved into public housing, which was on the very north border of Flint. And my first lesson in environmental justice is that polluting facilities always get placed, or often right on the border of municipalities, so that they just sneak them in. And it's kind of one of the, so the prayer center was located on the other side of the street, and we were, our thing was to just listen to people, pray with them, listen to them, and you'll hear what is dangerous, what's hurting, and what can we do about it. And so they were going to put in the Genesee Power Station, which was, and we went to the hearings. We were just, I mean, we didn't know anything. We would go to hearings and we would listen, and a lot of it sounded outrageous and racist. And the first thing we noticed was that in the documents that they would use, they had these big aerial views of the site, and they would say the land to the south is vacant. And it was where I lived, in a low-income housing area. In the next door neighborhood housing area, there were 3 mobile home parks that were very marginal housing, an elementary school. I mean, it wasn't vacant. I mean, it was just, but the aerial picture had Carpenter Road, and that said, well, on the other side is Flint, and there's nothing there. Well, there were people, mostly of color, and that was kind of our introduction. So we began to go to hearings. Always had to go to Lansing. Had one of the hearings that we went to, they would not listen to people that needed to testify, who had to, kind of act on the schedule early, because they had to go. One of them was a legislator, and the Capitol was kitty corner from where we were. Said, I've got to go over and cast a vote and do some things over there. One was a teacher from Flint, University of Michigan, Flint. She's got to go and proctor a test. And the white folk that needed to change their schedules were allowed to speak, but the black folk that wanted to speak weren't allowed to speak. And I mean, we're not real skilled and alert, but we began to say that doesn't look right or smell right or see. So, I mean, we were just beginning to get the drift of this whole business. And so we began to try to figure out, what do we do? And the Sugar Law Center in Detroit was willing to help us to be involved in a lawsuit against the state of Michigan and the county and the township, et cetera, et cetera. And that wasn't, we won at the local level, but then on appeal to the appellate court, they were very pro-business and just said, no, this is great, and so on. But the things that immediately that we learned were that doing something is better than doing nothing. And so, although later, as we learned about the civil rights complaint process, and it was magnificently unsuccessful for 25 years, doing something was better than nothing. And secondly, that doing it alone is unwise. And so we began to group more and more people, and we got some expert help from the Sugar Law Center and local attorneys and people like the American Lung Association, and we got other health people and tried to garner. There were a few local physicians that may not be in the field of medicine that directly pertain, but they saw this was not a good idea. And so we, the more and more that's how the lawsuit kind of came from the neighborhood, and the NAACP helped us very eloquently and so on. So, and we were kind of gaining expertise by experience. And so we would insist on certain things, like stop having hearings in Lansing, but have them in the local level so people can get there. because the poor don't have, a lot of them don't have cars, don't have all kinds of stuff. And even the way of communicating to people, a lot did not have the internet, did not have a phone, were afraid. And even in those days, although ICE has become even a more noxious presence, Hispanic folk were often afraid to answer the door, all that kind of stuff. And so we heard Carrie Moss, who's now, I think, the head person in the ACLU in Michigan now, but she was at the Sugar Law Center, told us about the civil rights complaint, Title VI complaint. And so and gave us kind of a nuts and bolts, these things have to be in it. And in our fumbling, bumbling way, we put it together and we sent it off, and it got lost by the EPA for about 2 years and never heard a thing. And we'd try to, raise their consciousness, but never got much response. Suddenly it was discovered in the Chicago regional office, and they began to sort of act on it, which meant they didn't do anything. And so they sent a couple of people out, and every maybe 5 years they'd send a person or two out, and they would not have any idea what to do and what do you want. And we said, we don't want it constructed. Well, of course it got built, and we wanted some relief from the state of Michigan, who had behaved in a very racist way. And so we, had these various complaints and so on. So we did not ever get an answer. It was filed in 1992, and we finally got an answer on the last day of the Obama administration. And we later learned it had been written years before. That which they said was written years before, but they never did anything with it. And so we got frustrated that it almost didn't matter, because we were kind of between Reagan and Clinton and all that, and it almost didn't matter who was in charge. The EPA was utterly fruitless, lackadaisical, and so on. So that's all. So the Genesee Power Station case is going on, and then Select Steel was a group that wanted to have the steel crushing plant, and they always wanted this certain area that's just across the border into Genesee Township. And just as an example, when Catholic Hospital moved to Grand Blanc, where money was, into the Holly area, they were going to move the medical waste incinerator to our neighborhood on the north end. And we said, no, you're not going to do that. And you're going to really look bad. We will make sure you look bad. And so we kind of won that little victory. But so Select Steel, they wanted to build this crushing plant, and it's going to create jobs. It's going to be wonderful, and so on. And Governor Engler, who was a very pro-business governor at the time, said to Ann Good, and this came from Ann Good verbally, that, I need a decision that's not environmentally bad. And if I don't get it, I'm going to make sure that I work with the Republican Party to do away with all of the funding that has anything to do with the EPA, and especially anything to do with civil rights. Like, you won't have a nickel in your office, because we'll make sure of that stuff. So in 33 days, they made a decision. So we're at maybe year, oh gosh, I forget, maybe year 10 about this time. And suddenly in 33 days, they come up with this thing. And so we're saying, wait a minute, where's this civil rights justice? How can this be environmental justice? And so we went on, and we kept complaining and raising Cain, and nothing happened, and we were extremely outraged. And then we discovered Earth Justice, who contacted us and said, there's a group of people that have been left out in the cold by these decisions. The Office of Environmental Justice never made any determination in these other cases, and we were kind of the great-great-grandfather of that, because it had been the longest. It was into the 20 years now. And so they filed a suit against the EPA, and we won, much to the chagrin of the EPA. And it was, the victories can seem small. The victories can seem, we need so much more. Some of the other plaintiffs were just had such heartbreaking stories of degradation that was all based on race and class, mostly race. And it's very heartbreaking, but we, the other thing is, in addition to not doing it alone and not choosing to do nothing, it's you have to be willing to be in there for the long haul. And I realized we can't deter all the other people, the major players, except one, the head of the NAACP in Flint, who was there at the time of the beginning of this E-Hill deloaning, is still living. But all the other major players that were the key leaders that mobilized the community are gone. And so one other area that I just want to touch on for a minute is that if you're going to be involved in this stuff, it's not for the faint of heart. And so you need friends that are supportive and communicative and affirming. You need to have your own, whether you're a spiritual or reflect, whatever your kind of philosophy of life or spirituality or whatever it is, you've got to have a way to keep yourself calm so you don't literally maybe commit a crime and go shoot somebody. I mean, I was probably pretty close to that. I mean, I would get very upset, and just to see the disdain that people have for the poor was incredible. And for Black folk and brown folk, and as I got to know these other plaintiffs, I just said, wow, how can people look at life that way? So you need some kind of a spiritual grounding kind of thing, meditation or whatever it is, and you also need a sense of humor. I have a peace activist friend, Peter Doherty, who's a Catholic priest who's been in the peace movement since way before, early in the Vietnam War. He has a great clownish sense of humor, and that keeps everybody sort of sane. Well, that's questioned sometimes, but you need humor. You need to, or you'll just get ground up and burn out and be angry and bitter, and the poison will destroy you, not the people that you're angry with. So I guess that's all I want to say for now. I was so gratified. I mean, I didn't have a lot of experience with attorneys. I had friends who were attorneys, but Sugar Law Center and just the wealth, and there were a couple of attorneys from Detroit that just volunteered, and all the people that came in after at Sugar Law Center, and a couple of local attorneys, and Earth Justice is just a rich place of outstanding talent that without that, I would be sitting in a rocking chair somewhere saying, well, that was too bad. I guess we're never going to win anything. And I do have hope. And that is really, really important. That's a good resource to have. Part of my job is to kind of nurture that hope and be present as much as I can, and also learn a little bit on the way to speak my piece when I have a chance.
Thank you, Father Phil. Thank you so much. And we're going to move from Father Phil's presentation to Ron Smith. Ron is also a reverend in the AMA Church, so we have another person from religious groups. Both the St. Francis Prayer Center and the Asher Spar Smith Community Organization that Ron is president of are two of the communities that were part of the CARE versus EPA litigation that Father Phil was talking about. And I did put a press release about the decision and the decision itself from this week in the chat. And as Father Phil said, when I was at Earth Justice at the time, and what we wound up doing was bringing a case against EPA on behalf of 5 communities and 1 individual who had filed complaints in Father Phil's case more than 2 decades before, but in every case more than a decade before. And EPA had accepted those cases for investigation more than a decade before. So every case was more than a decade overdue, because EPA under its regulations has 180 days to do an investigation. And so it seemed like a slam dunk. Strangely, instead of just working with the communities to find some way to address the delay and the injustice, EPA and the Department of Justice have been litigating this out the hilt. And even after we won the case, the Department of Justice filed a motion to amend because it didn't like the idea that the court had ordered it to abide by the law for 5 years, should any of these groups file additional civil rights complaints and have to resolve the case within 180 days. But that's the issue. We won this week, and that's sort of a sweet victory. Having said that, it's still enormously frustrating for all of us that EPA still is not addressing the underlying issues in each community, and we'll get to that. With that, I'd love to turn it over to Ron Smith. Thank you so much for taking time to join us, and we'd love to hear about your experience in the Ashard-Spar-Smith community.
Hey, I'm still on the highway, so I may lose you in and out. First of all, greetings to everyone. And Father Phil, I was hearing what you said, and there's our community situation's a little bit different. It's predominantly African American, and it's a very rural area, and it's a very poor community. And our situation got started actually back in the late 80s, early 90s. And what actually happened was a small dump kind of area sold out to a waste disposal company. And our community rallied the best that they could to fight it here. But I'm going to tell you, Alabama, kind of give you an idea, the sunshine law that we had has pretty much disappeared right now. Legislation just got passed to really kind of just bar the public from participating in those decisions almost at all. But during that time here, my parents and other seniors in the community did speak up. They protested against the landfill being sited in the community and basically got ignored. And really not a whole lot has changed since that time in terms of passing permits and citing here. The community still protests, but it basically falls on deaf ears. One of our members who I was hoping going to be able to participate today here, Phyllis Gosa, I think in 2003, filed a claim against EPA for violation of Title VI and the Administrative Procedures Act. And that's what Marianne was talking about when she said here that those, that claim was accepted, but it sit on the books for a long time, 10 or 15 years it sit on the books, and nothing happened until Herb Justice got involved and started bringing some resources to the community and started to give some publicity to what was going on. And even with that, as Marianne said, it had to wind up going to court and then to the nail. Finally here we just got a little bit of relief here from the courts. But the situation is still very much present in our community. We do have a landfill. There are plenty of atrocities that we could tell you about in terms of the landfill itself, trying to run people out of the community and acquire more land there. But our situation is still in the same place. I missed out on the first part and not really sure what I'm addressing right now, so I don't want to ramble. I might need a little bit of help to get on track with what needs to be said here.
You're doing great, Ron. If you want to say anything about, you've talked a little bit about the challenges, how long this took. Were there any lessons learned? Were there any benefits of using the Title VI strategy in terms of, in any way? And are there any other lessons learned about, as a community, how to use it effectively?
Well, if we could turn back the hands of time, so to speak, in terms of Title VI and the enforcement of Title VI is where the issue is that we feel. We tried going through, the agency's specific complaint routes and that kind of thing here, and basically got laughed at pretty much. From where we stand here, from an enforcement standpoint, Title VI has no teeth. And you've almost got to approach these companies based on the more technical side of things to get anything done. And a lot of people disagree with me here, but Marianne, I got a chance to read some of the information you sent me, but the conclusion on the work that you did here was there needed to be kind of a third-party neutral agency that policed, enforcement of Title VI. And that even needs to be at the Department of Justice, in my opinion, but that'll never work. So what we did, if we had to do it over again here, we would really need to be able to gather information pertinent to things like health, getting some baseline data, because we do have some problems that are showing up more and more every day, so that we'd be able to back it. But my experience in Alabama here is that once you take one route, they just change the legislation and you wind up back at ground zero again. So I think the other thing too is that out of our frustration with ADEM, the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, and not really getting anywhere, basically being laughed at, we started to ignore them altogether and bypass them, going straight to EPA, hoping to get some help. So now what ADEM says that we've never filed any claims with them, we've never used their system, so they don't see a problem. So that was kind of a little lesson we learned too. I guess you got to stick with those systems, even though they drain your energy and they don't work. And then going to EPA and hoping to get some relief from EPA also kind of proved to be a lot of energy expended, and a lot of that was expended by Earth Justice, by Marianne and Yale, to try to get some results. So, this unfair burden they talk about, they keep dumping it on us. We don't have time to do all of this stuff. We don't have resources to do all of this stuff. And one of the reasons that they came to us is because we don't have the resources to defend ourselves, that we became the path of least resistance. So we learned that. And the other thing is, if you're in rural areas of Alabama and you're unincorporated here, you pretty much open anything here the government wants to do. I don't know if that kind of hits the spot with anyone out here, but that's kind of where we are.
Thank you. And if you are able to stay on, we'll have some questions in a few minutes. Let me switch gears. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. And I have to move this over. And let's see how we can do this. Okay, here we go. Hopefully that works. And actually, the photo on the right is the advanced disposal landfill that Reverend Smith was talking about. That is what, I should just say, the Ashers Bar Smith community is a community set up, and Ron, you can jump in and correct me at any point, but set up by and settled by newly freed persons who had been enslaved right after the Civil War during Reconstruction. And the land has been passed on from generation to generation. Often families live on the land, and it's beautiful in the hills. It's in an unincorporated area, and it's outside of the town of Tallahassee. And so it's Black-owned land. And this land, and it's hilly, and so it's quite beautiful. And as you turn the corner on Washington Boulevard, this is what you see. And it's enormous, and it smells, and it's decreasing property value, and it's affecting people's health. So that's the picture on the right-hand side, and that contrasts with the promise of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So it's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to speak with Vernice and Father Phil and Reverend Smith, and to be on this panel. My own background is in civil rights. I worked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, and then spent some time at Earth Justice, and I currently am working with interdisciplinary groups of students at Vermont Law School and Yale. And we're working on civil rights enforcement in the environmental justice area and enforcement of the environmental justice executive order, which maybe we'll have more time to talk about later on. And we also try to enforce environmental laws. I should say we're focusing on the civil rights law here, but we need to use all the tools we have as every point of leverage, and none of them are adequate. With apologies to those of you who are already familiar with Title VI, I'm going to try to pick up a little bit where Vernice left off. So Vernice read Title VI, that no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, denied the benefits of, or subjected to discrimination. Note that it only focuses on race, color, or national origin, but it's pretty broad. It prohibits exclusion, denial of benefits, or discrimination, and then it gives authorizes agencies to effectuate that. It doesn't define discrimination, and any recipient of federal funds is theoretically bound. I say theoretically because it's not sufficiently enforced, but is bound by Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So schools, hospitals, environmental organizations, states, localities, any public or private agency that receives federal funds. Every agency has promulgated regulations. They've passed regulations, many of them many decades ago, to give meaning to this word. What does it mean to not be able to discriminate? What is discrimination? And all of them, every single one, has said that discrimination is not only intentional discrimination, but actions with unjustified, disproportionate impacts. And here you see two of a number of provisions in EPA's regulations that define what discrimination is or define what's prohibited. So for example, a recipient, that is a recipient of federal funds like ADEM, Alabama Department of Environmental Management, or EGLE, Michigan's Environmental Department, shall not use criteria or methods of administering its program which have the effect of subjecting individuals to discrimination. Or recipient shall not choose a site or location of a facility that has the effect of excluding individuals. So, so this is really important, that every agency's regulations prohibit actions that are intentionally discriminatory or have the effect of discriminating. What do we know about the United States and our land use? We know that racism is baked into land use. We had segregation, and we never uprooted where facilities are located, which are residential zones, which areas are zoned industrial. We know from great books like Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. We know from experience of people on the ground that, that racism is baked into how we use land. And so what Title VI tells our environmental agencies, what Title VI tells applicants for permits that, that have received federal funds, energy companies, et cetera, it tells them you can't take actions that further exacerbate those racial impacts. And we know from tremendous research, Paul Mohai, Robin Saha, even at EPA, that African Americans and Latinos and the indigenous populations, they are more exposed to particulate matter and pollutions. We know, going back to Vernice's great work in the 80s, that the siting of facilities is more likely, hazardous facilities, more likely to be near communities of color, right? So this law should be telling everyone, pause, when you're gonna permit a new facility, examine whether it's gonna have a disparate impact, figure out whether there's a different place you can put it, or whether you can mitigate the harm, and then only then go forward. But we need to enforce the law, and that's where the challenge comes in. So EPA, so I put in the chat a new study that just came out from the EPA's own Office of Inspector General. It came out Monday, and the Office of Inspector General criticized EPA for failing to operationalize, failing to supervise, failing to force compliance with Title VI. And it actually said, EPA, you have to respond to our recommendations. Otherwise, we're going to take you through an administrative process. And one of those recommendations is EPA doesn't have to wait around for a complaint. It can affirmatively enforce the law, but it doesn't. Other agencies do, the Department of Education does, EPA has never done it. So we got to demand that. And then we can also bring complaints, as you've heard Father Phil say he did, and Ron Smith said the Ashers Bar Smith Community Organization did. If you bring a complaint, it can be a complaint on a number of different bases. I'm going to come back to this in a second. You can complain about intentional discrimination, although if you have an intentional discrimination claim, you can go to court. It can complain of the failure to provide translation and interpretation services. That's a violation of Title VI. Actions, policies, or practices with an unjustified disparate impact. That's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the time. Retaliation and intimidation, exclusion from participation in processes, failure to evaluate disparate impact. Those can all be the source of a complaint. But I'm going to focus on disparate impact claims because they're the ones that we're talking about as coming up on these citing efforts. That is that there's an action, policy, or practice that causes an adverse impact that disproportionately affects people in one racial group or national origin group more than another. And then a court, or if you could go to court, or an agency will ask, well, is it justified? Sometimes we have to do things that we don't want to do because it's the only place to put it or the only way to do it. But is it justified, or is there a less discriminatory alternative or ways to mitigate the harm? This is a really powerful idea. We use the same thinking, the same analysis in employment discrimination, in housing discrimination. If an agency or group gets federal money, it must evaluate what it's doing and see if there's a less discriminatory approach to achieving the goal, right? It causes us, in this moment of Black Lives Matter, it causes us to say, do we really need to exacerbate racial inequality, or is there another way of doing things? And this is in the law. Unfortunately, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, in 2001, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision written by Justice Scalia, said we can only go to court if we can show intentional discrimination. So every other claim, like a claim of unjust disparate impact, we have to file with a federal agency that has explained in its regulations that unjustified disparate impact claims or actions are a violation of law. So that's why we're dependent on EPA. And that's why it's so important that EPA do a good job. And I put in the chat also an article I wrote a couple of years ago that Ron was talking about, that where I say, let's take this responsibility away from EPA and every other agency that's done a terrible job. Why don't we have an agency that enforces the rights? Why don't we do this differently? It's been decades. How long do we have to wait? So that's an idea we could play around with. But after Sandoval, communities and activists with a disparate impact claim are left to file administrative complaints with federal agencies. I want to tell you that there are bills in Congress to overturn Sandoval. And that's something we need everyone to get involved in. There's the Booker bill, which is the Environmental Justice Act of 2019. There's the EJ for All Act. And there are a lot of bad things about the energy bill that passed the House on September 24th, the Clean Energy and Jobs Innovation Act. But it includes a provision to overturn Sandoval. And that's a real marker. Congressman Grijalva, Chair Grijalva, for the first time was able to move getting rid of Sandoval and being able to go to court for communities on their own without having to rely on titles on the EPA, and that would be really important. The bill also, these two bills also do some other really important things, like enshrine in law the terms of the EJ executive order, really important, requiring cumulative impact analysis for permitting, and would target more resources to EJ communities. You should know that whenever a recipient of federal fund gets money from EPA, it's supposed to assure compliance with Title VI. And one of the things the Office of Inspector General criticized EPA for is they really don't enforce this. They just sign off, okay, you say that you're compliant, Okay, all good. And it's got to enforce that. There is another way to do this. I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but we can look at the Department of Education. We can look at the Department of Transportation that require recipients of federal funds to provide data, that require recipients of federal funds to do an analysis. They're not where they need to be, but it's night and day compared to EPA. For example, the US Department of Education handles thousands of cases and does affirmative investigations. So what does it look like to file a Title VI administrative complaint? You file a complaint, as Father Phil suggested, with the federal agency that provides the financial assistance to the program or activity. So if it's your environmental department, they get federal money from EPA. And the complaint must be filed within 180 days of whatever you're complaining about. There's some other requirements. There's a case resolution manual at EPA that you can look at to understand those other requirements. Unfortunately, complainants aren't seen as parties. You can advocate, you can send material, you can send evidence. And I know Ron Smith was very involved in taking pictures and sending evidence. And we had a very compelling case there. The Office of Civil Rights, it's called the External Civil Rights Compliance Office at EPA, can attempt informal resolution, they can investigate, or they can offer alternative dispute resolution. I just want to highlight something Father Phil said. Oftentimes, what triggers these cases is that communities are completely ignored by their environmental department at the local, county, or state level. Rendered invisible. And your story, Father Phil, about someone saying that the area is vacant is heard over and over and over. I think about Uniontown, Alabama, where coal ash was brought. And why was it brought? The county commissioner said, oh, there's no one who lives there. They do live there. Their health matter, Black Lives Matter. That's what we have to keep saying. So that's why we need to file these cases. They're not a cure-all. They're frustrating, but they raise up the reality of race discrimination. They bring it out of the shadow and they raise these claims, and then you can translate into leverage. And I want to remind any law student in the room that the goals of legal action aren't always a decisive court ruling. Like, it's great that we got a great court ruling this week. And sometimes you can get injunctive relief. In some kinds of cases, you can get damage. But some laws are to create political space. That is, you might have a right to a hearing. You might have a right to be heard. And that allows political momentum. Some laws give you space to articulate a narrative to say, we're being discriminated against. Right? And this is racist and we need to do something about it. Sometimes getting into court, you can get discovery. Of course, all cases can't be frivolous. No case can be frivolous. All cases have to have merit. But if you get into court and you get discovery, you can get information and build a record. Ultimately, they all have to support community-based movement. As I said, there are lots of applicable laws. Each of those has limitations. I'm just going to take 2 more minutes to tell you about this one complaint, just to use it as another example. We filed a complaint having to do with the impacts of the hog industry in North Carolina. And here you see North Carolina EJ Network, Environmental Justice Network, Waterkeeper Alliance, that's Larry Baldwin. This is Steve Wing. This case really epitomizes something that this symposium it really represents, which is the combination of community-based activism, research, community-based participatory research in particular, and lawyers and activists and how we can work together. And that's what we did in this case to address inequalities. Again, we had to show an adverse impact, that it disproportionately hit people on the basis of race, and then rebut any justification that North Carolina had for permitting industrial animal operations over and over every 5 years with the same lousy permits that were not protecting people. This is a picture actually of a dairy facility, but I just wanted to show it to you because it's a good aerial view. You get smell and chemicals from the barns. Notice you don't have any animals outside. They're all in these facilities. You might have thousands and thousands of animals. They're all excreting feces and urine that go into these open cesspools and then are sprayed over fields. All of that affects water, health, air pollution, what you breathe in. And I'm going to just show you some pictures because a picture is worth 1,000 words. So those are the sprayers. You can imagine living next door, how that gets into your, you can't no longer can put your laundry outside, just like living near a landfill, actually. You can no longer have a barbecue outside. You get flies. And that literally, I've been sprayed by that manure when I've gone to look and sat at the boundary line. Broken sprayers obviously are going to hit people or oversaturate the spray fields. Here's a picture. You can see the sprayers in the background as well, but there's also puddling, which means that there's excess pollution from the manure that's getting into waterways and seeping down. This picture was taken by a water keeper. It shows the erosion from a spray field. They're spraying manure, and that's all just going down right into Stocking Head Creek in North Carolina, and of course is impairing the waterway. These facilities are in a hurricane zone, and so you get flooding and waste leaching from aging lagoons and runoff, and that's a picture from Hurricane Matthew. I mentioned air pollution. It comes out of those big fans. Air pollution means effect on people's lives. Those fans blow the pollution, and those are some of the chemicals that you can expect. If you're sensitive to pictures of animals, you can close your eyes for a minute. I just want to show you how they dispose of the animals. This is disposal. Eastern North Carolina has a very low water table. Or the water is very high to the surface. It's a coastal area, and it has the highest concentration of pigs in the country, as well as poultry overlaid to that. And here are pigs that are disposed. There is not the land. It all gets into the water to hold the animals. And this is another form of disposal of dead animals, obviously not healthy and a vector of disease. And this is the proximity to people's sacred spaces. And one of our clients in Eastern North Carolina standing in her family graveyard. Really quickly, this is showing how many, this is Brittany Johnson's home, within a 3-mile radius, how many facilities there are. And each of those facilities has these open lagoons that are like cesspools for whole towns of like 15,000 people. And can you imagine the flies, the dirt, and so we showed impact. That's the kind of evidence you need to pull together. We also showed that impact affected people disproportionately. Each of these dots is a hog facility, and the pink is 40%, over 40% people of color. This is the old black belt, and you can see the relationship between race and where the facilities are located. So we filed the complaint, like in the case of Flint and Alabama and Tallahassee. EPA sat on it. They accepted the complaint, sat on it. So we went to them. We said, if you're not coming to us, we're going to you. Nahima Muhammad, the head of the North Carolina EJ Network, Waterkeeper, Elsie Herring, they all came in vans. We sat, met with people. This was during the Obama administration. They came, they did an inspection, and they came out in January 2017 with a letter of concern. And that letter wasn't a finding of discrimination, which they should have produced, but it did create some leverage. And we went into alternative dispute resolution, which creates an ability to sit across the table. I know some of you have been in alternative dispute resolution, and start to build trust and start to have a conversation. We didn't get everything we wanted. It's sort of like Father Phil said, it's, you start getting a little bit of leverage, you start having a conversation, and maybe things can change. The confined animal feeding operations are still there. People are still being poisoned, but we got something, and it created some leverage. So I'm going to stop there. And what I'd like to do is pitch 1 or 2 questions and then open it up for discussion. And please, I'm encouraging you to put any questions or comments into the chat so we can get to some of them. So the first question I want to ask, and just ask everyone to limit their answers to about a minute. We've been talking about environmental justice law at the federal level, but there's a lot happening at the state level. I'm wondering, Vernice, if you can talk about what's happened maybe in Virginia. Father Phil, do you see any improvement in Michigan? And Ron, you talked about how awful things are in Alabama. Do you see any cracks, any hope for change, or what can we do to be helpful at the state level? Vernice. I think you're still on mute, Vernice.
Thank you. I don't want to get out ahead of the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality and the Virginia Attorney General's office and the Office of the Governor of Virginia, but in the next couple of weeks, they will be coming out with the findings of a study that a team that I led did for the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality and Environmental Justice Study. And there's a whole component of the study that talks about legal authorities. And so this is actually something I meant to address in my comments, but one of the cascading negative impacts across all these states that you've heard about today, Michigan and Alabama and every other state in the union, one of the reasons that their environment, energy, and natural resource agencies do not step up and more vigorously attend to racial discrimination issues in terms of enforcement of civil rights is because EPA itself has been negligent and quite frankly has refused. They make small gestures here and there, but they really don't believe in that it's part of the mission of the agency to pursue racial discrimination and to really fully enforce civil rights law. And since they're sort of weak-kneed about it, they have not been clear to their recipient agencies, meaning state agencies, local government, county agencies, and sometimes tribal governments as well, as to what their requirements are to enforce the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And since the federal government is not telling the state governments what to do, then they just go forward with either programs that are completely and utterly lacking or are also weak-kneed. So the state of Virginia had no program whatsoever within the Department of Environmental Quality, but in collaboration with the governor's office and the Virginia legislature passed a new EJ for All Act, I think that's what it's called, in its last legislative session, which has really unleashed the power and guidance of the state government to pursue these issues. And so we have recommended to Virginia DEQ that they really step up and build civil rights enforcement into the legal authorities of the agency itself. And folks will be hearing more about that in the next couple of weeks. But it's a huge step for the state of Virginia and for the people of the Commonwealth of Virginia, particularly EJ communities in the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Thanks, Vernice. Father Phil, do you want to add anything about your experience in Michigan?
He's on mute.
Yes, I do just a couple of things. The state of Michigan, of course, we had the water crisis that went on. That's the last 5 years, really, and it was just terrible. In the state of Michigan, unfortunately, when you get people that absolutely lie, I mean, they did not tell the truth, and the EPA was no better. That's kind of the low abyss of malfeasance by any kind of institution or governor. I mean, it was just a very bad situation. But a thing that happened back in the previous stuff that I was involved with, I foolishly thought that the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality was an impartial group of people that would evaluate kind of the industry or whatever that wanted to build stuff, and the people that said no, that's not good. But there's a turnaround in the Michigan personnel in these committees and commissions, where somebody from industry winds up being the head of the Department of Environmental Quality, or they're one of the engineers and this or that. And then after they've done their damage there, then there was one engineer that was just a cheerleader for the Genesee Power Station. And that I believe a direct quote was, "If you don't believe in this technology, you are stupid." And so I just said, wow, this guy. And later he was hired by Consumers Energy. And they said, oh, that's how it works. So legislation in the state has never overcome that issue. And I think it's still a problem. I mean, there has to be lobbyists, for example. I mean, the EPA is a good case in point right now with lobbyists being put in charge of, the Fox is given the responsibility of being fair to the chickens in the chicken coop, and it's just a disaster. And so, you know, I hope that somehow as we advocate and so on, there may come a time when we can legislate less lobbying and more impartiality that is demanded by the structure that we create. Because right now, you know, structural racism is exactly what it is, and the rush to quote jobs is part of what contaminates that thing. That those in the 1% just see themselves entitled to make more and more and more money, and that's one of the ways they do it.
Thank you. Ron Smith, you want to add anything? You're on mute.
Finally got out of my car, so I hadn't unmuted anything. Everything that I'm hearing that the previous two speakers said is what we need. I don't know if we will get it here in Alabama, though. I'm getting a lot of feedback. Can you guys hear me okay?
You are getting some feedback, but you're coming through. So maybe if there's a key point you want to make.
All right, just the thing here in Alabama, well, I think we're going to have a little bit, well, all of this is tough, but I'll just give you an example. One of the attorneys that's been helping us for a number of years challenged the Alabama Department of Environmental Management's authority to allow landfills to use alternative covers in that landfill. And they've been doing that using tarps. Tarps were full of holes, and you know, they just kind of went through the motion on doing things. The odor was terrible, the vermin were terrible, the buzzards were terrible. That attorney actually went to Alabama's Court of Appeals, and he won that case. And I pretty much told him in an email, I said, well, the only thing they're going to do is they're going to change the regulation, which is exactly what they did. It's change the regulation, so we're back to square one. The other thing here, I was just telling you here that the Alabama Supreme Court has given kind of a open door to the Alabama Public Service Commission here to close the doors on their public meetings, what used to be public meetings here. And so we're really going backwards, in my opinion, in terms of trying to get things done. And how are we going to resolve that? Basically here with the many, many issues that we have, everything from Black Lives Matter to, you know, school systems and everything else that are going on, is getting people to focus on some of these environmental legislations that we need. It's going to take a rally along the lines of the Black Lives Matter movement in order to get our legislature in Alabama to do anything. And so right now we're pretty divided over the whole thing, and getting that to happen is going to be tough.
Thank you. What I would add to that is that's precisely why we need to work at the state level and the federal level, because any state-by-state approach could create great models. It could create great protection in a particular state, but that is the very reason for national civil rights or national environmental law, to protect in those states the people as much as anywhere else as a nation, to provide that equal protection. So we can't only go in one level. We have to be thinking about legislation and civil rights enforcement at a national level too. Having said that, there are some really exciting things happening at the state level. And someone put in the chat, and I think Vernice has responded at least a little bit, what about cumulative impacts at the state level? And of course, New Jersey has passed a really exciting new bill not only requiring consideration of cumulative impacts in permitting, but where there are exacerbations of pollution in the most impacted areas, those permits cannot be given. So it is about starting to deal with emissions reduction. But there are also states that are passing new definitions of environmental justice, making environmental justice the law of the state, creating EJ advisory committees, creating mapping tools that, like the state of Washington and California, CalEnviroscreen, Maryland, Michigan, that will allow us to see which are the parts of the state that have the most cumulative impact, where permits should not go, but more resources should be targeted to address pollution. So none of those is a cure-all, but each of those is an exciting new area where we can start really to dig in and address those inequalities. We are running out of time, so I'm going to ask each of the speakers to either address this question or in 1 minute just to any final thoughts to address that. So my final question was going to be that, as we've discussed, the history of civil rights enforcement in this space has been abysmal. Biden's platform includes improvement in civil rights enforcement in the environmental context. If you could make recommendations for reform to Biden, if you had his ear, what would be your advice? So that, or anything final you want to say. Vernice.
Combine the Office of Civil Rights and the Office of Environmental Justice, give it more authority, and give it a budget, and give it a director that cares passionately about these issues, that has background and expertise. Hire people in the Office of Civil Rights or to direct the Office of Civil Rights that actually knows how to conduct a civil rights complaint. That would be a start. And it would be a good start. Hire people in that office that care about civil rights, that have expertise, and that the administrator of the agency, and this is really important for Vice President Biden, should he become the president-elect, across the breadth of the federal government, civil rights need to be given renewed enforcement, renewed investment. But what is the point of having a Civil Rights Act if we are not going to vigorously enforce it? And that would include the Attorney General of the United States. I think under Obama, the Attorney General was great, but they left off the issue of civil rights enforcement within the environment, energy, and natural resources sector. They've got to step up and make sure that every branch of the federal government is doing its job, and then pushing that enforcement down to all the other levels of governance.
Thank you. Father Phil?
That if, as the federal government impacts in any way state government, they need, like a lot of these state things have like some kind of committee, and there'll be one kind of token person that represents kind of the environment, you know, like a Sierra Club person or whatever. But they need, you know, a percentage, like a third of the group have to be of the people, or it's gonna get nowhere. They also have to restrict lobbyists for something like 10 years, that a lobbyist can't become a part of this committee, the DEQ, the whatever, and they, you know, that they cannot come out of industry, come on there and then sit and have that group approve everything that industry wants. And I guess they can't influence people leaving the committee, but I mean, I've seen very unholy stuff where people stepped right out of a committee or commission and stepped right into the executive suite of a big corporation to do their bidding, and that just makes them an apologist for pollution and the kind of stuff we're trying to stop.
Thank you. Community engagement. It needs to come from the community. Thank you. Reverend Smith?
Okay, just want to add to what both of the previous speakers just said here. The big thing I see again here, and you all summed it up, I can't sum up the way you could get in detail, but compliance and enforcement is, we need that independent agency that does the compliance and enforcement. Mary, you heard me say it before, because I worked in agencies with civil rights officers, and they are not there to protect the public. They are there to keep the agency out of trouble. And so we need someone to police them. You know, like you said, we need in the summary of your report, we do need an independent agency that is somewhat tasked with the responsibility of policing enforcement. I think that's my bottom line. I can't add anything else to what's been said already.
Thank you. I mean, at bottom, all these recommendations come from a place of we need to address racial and economic inequality in the distribution of environmental pollution. And that has to be a priority. And there are legislative pieces and there are actions that a Biden administration can take, whether it's creating that new agency that might require legislative action, but starting to make that happen. I also think this may sound very geeky and administrative, but offices of civil rights need to hire their own attorneys. They can't be dependent on offices of general counsel, which are defending the agency. They can't be so worried that a state is going to sue them and fight a discrimination claim that they don't actually enforce the law. So that's a geeky solution, but it's, I think there are executive actions and legislative actions that they can take. And ultimately, all of them have to wind up making a difference on the ground by targeting resources to those communities that are environmentally overburdened, and particularly where they're stratified by race, where they're communities of color. That's just unacceptable in our society to be overburdened because of race. And to target those resources to those communities, and also fundamentally, if a community is overburdened, to stop putting more hazardous facilities in there. Got to stop those disparities in asthma, in cancer, and now in COVID. Thank you all for your participation. Vernice, did you want to say one more thing?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the Office of Civil Rights, or the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department, also needs to step up its game. We petitioned them on countless occasions over the 8 years of the Obama administration to step up their game and make sure that federal agencies were fully enforcing the Civil Rights Act, particularly to recipient entities, and they wanted no part of that conversation. They deferred to the Environmental Division at DOJ, and DOJ referred it back to the Civil Rights Division, and neither of them did anything. So if you're going to be a Civil Rights Division and you're in charge of enforcing civil rights for the nation, then do your job. Not just EPA, but the Justice Department has to do its job. Of course, the Justice Department under a different Attorney General, not this Attorney General, but a different Attorney General that might come in a new administration.
I just want to acknowledge there was one more question in the chat as to whether the Ninth Circuit decision in 2016 in Garcia versus McCarthy, which concluded that EPA has plenary power over how it has absolute power over how it enforces Title VI, whether that has any impact not only on EPA's delays, but on what they actually decide. That was a terrible decision. It certainly doesn't help. There may be ways of distinguishing it, but it really focused on only how it uses its resources to make priorities in enforcement. And if they're delayed, that's still a violation of the 180-day requirement. And so Garcia has no impact on the timelines, on the ability to bring suit about whether they're violating the timelines for taking action. I also think it is vulnerable to challenge if there's a different kind of case where we can show that EPA violated legal standards that are well settled. And we've been thinking about that and seeing if we can sort of cordon off Garcia versus McCarthy either to the Ninth Circuit or on its facts. So to be continued, great question. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Vernice and Father Phil and Reverend Smith, and also thanks to all of you for participating. I know all of you could have been on this panel and would have had a lot to say, and I hope at least that this provided additional food for thought. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be on the panel with you, gentlemen, a true honor.
Likewise with you also. And Marianne, always, you're my hero.
You too. It's mutual, and same Father.
Absolutely. Earth Justice and you, Marianne, and all these clinics, the law schools with the clinics that are trying to dig their teeth into these issues, that's just a wonderful thing. So thank you for the privilege of meeting Vernice and Ron and of course seeing you. This was a very nice
And you know, you can never retire, Father Phil, never retire.
Well, I may retire from what, the being a pastor, but that doesn't mean I can't be dabbling around. I want to come down and see Ron Smith, and I want to come to Virginia. I want to come to Alabama. Phyllis, I hear those stories, and I want to be a part of it.
Well, you
Come on
started
down.
with the theme of working together, and I think that's where we're ending, that it's really important that we all continue to work together and try to support community-based movements. Ron, did you want to say something?
No, I was just telling Father Phil to come on down.
I'll have to do it after I retire, but we'll see each other again.
I understand.
Thank you all. Thanks, Vernice.
Bye, all.
Yeah,
Have a great afternoon.
you too.
Denise,
Yes, ma'am.
how do we get back to the closing panel?
I believe there was supposed to be a link sent out for that
Yes, it was. So
in
go to
the
that.
itinerary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for troubleshooting when we couldn't get into the room. That was really helpful. A little bit of a shaky start there. Okay.
Great job, Marion. A great job.
Okay. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Goodbye.